Hi, everybody. We are recording. And if you, hi, Danny. If you didn't listen to yesterday's recording, you can all definitely be heard. So feel free to yell random things out. Let's take a second to honor our other AP World students who are currently suffering through physics.
Our soldiers.
Yes. We've got James, Kimura, Marta, and Pratik. They are all collectively, Comrade James. They're all collectively suffering. It's 9:30, so they started an hour and a half ago. They're about halfway through the exam.
Isn't the exam at 12? No?
I think it goes to about 11:30-ish.
So they're not suffering yet.
Oh, they're still there. Oh, does it start late? I thought it was a morning
I
exam.
think it's
No, it's
I can check. Wait, yeah, I can. Hold on.
Anyway, at some point you're taking an exam. Good luck. So, oh, well, you're not taking the test yet, but you will. Let's talk about Unit 4. Yesterday we were focusing on Columbus and how he sailed the ocean blue and made his way to not the United States, but actually the Caribbean. So what changes for Latin America in this time period? Let's talk about some of the changes. Remember, the triangle means change. What changes in Latin America in this unit? Yeah, tell me about how the economy changes, because otherwise I would write vague on the side of your paper. How does the economy change? They do. Let's then... You're talking about politics now. What happens to a lot of Central and South American empires? Yeah, what do we call that? What's the term? Colonized. Good. We're not looking at imperialism yet. It's just colonization. By which two countries mostly? Good. Spain and Portugal. Even though Portugal only really got one colony. We'll do Spain in red. Spain gets all the things. What is the line that divided them called? Nope, the 38th parallel is the Korean War. This line right here is drawn up by the Pope in 1494, so 2 years after Columbus. What was the name of this line? It sounds a bit like tortillas. Good, Tordesillas. Please don't write Treaty of Tortillas on your test if it comes up. The Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, drawn up by the Pope. What was the point of it? Yeah, kind of. So, in their exploration, the Spanish can explore everything, to the west of this line, and Portugal can explore everything to the east of this line. What else might that include for Portugal? Africa, exactly, which is why we don't see a lot of Spanish colonization in Africa, but we do see a lot of Portuguese settlements and coastal trading towns and all of that. The Portuguese end up more in Africa than the Spanish do, and a lot of that goes back to this, the Treaty of Tordesillas, which keeps them separate, is the plan. So, politically speaking, they all get colonized by the Spanish and by the Portuguese. To a lesser extent, they are colonized by the British and the Dutch and the French. But how does the economy change? Tell me about it. Yes. This is where we see the rise of mercantilism. Mercantilism. Dan, I dotted my I's. Are you happy? I dotted my I's.
Oh, I was about to say that. I was about to notice that you dotted it.
He doesn't deserve it.
And now they're all undotted.
Okay, that's not even an L anymore.
It's just gone. It was colonnade. All right, so what we see instead is mercantilism. Can somebody explain to me what mercantilism is? It involves two groups. Good. So we've got the mother country over here. For all intents and purposes, let's just pretend that this one is Spain. And how does the relationship work between the mother country and her colonies? Right. Now, the mother country can profit off of anybody and anything, but her colonies can only trade with her, nobody else. They can't trade with rival powers. They're not even supposed to be trading with each other so much, right? The colonies trade to Spain. Spain benefits, the colonies provide. That's the idea behind mercantilism. And that really dominates the economy for Latin America throughout all of Unit 4. It does change when these colonies become independent in Unit 5. But as you guys mentioned before, that's when we see economic dependency. Turns out they're still trading with the Europeans, more of them, not just the one country, but they're still engaged in trade with the West, and that severely handicaps them. Good. Tell me about some social changes. So if an economic change is mercantilism, and if we talked about how these countries all become colonies, tell me about the social structure. In fact, we'll just keep the triangle motif. Good. Where's the other place in the world where we see a caste system? India. Good. But in Latin America, we see a caste system also. Who's at the very top of the caste system? Yeah, no, but they're right underneath. Yes, they are from the Iberian Peninsula. They are the Spanish, they're not the Iberials. They're the Spanish or the Portuguese. Let's just, I'm more familiar with Spanish. So it's the Spanish at the top, right? But what do we call them? The Peninsulares. Good, because they come from the Iberian Peninsula. Peninsulares, meaning from the peninsula. And then we have the Creoles. And what's the difference between them? Because I thought they were both Europeans.
Creoles were born in the
Place of birth.
Good. The only difference is where they were born. Why is that messed up? And that's exactly how the Creoles felt. I mean, they wouldn't have said, that's messed up, yo. But they were, can you imagine? Simón Bolívar in his famous speech at Angostura, that's messed up, yo. The difference between them is where they were born. Peninsulares and Creoles have the same genetic makeup, the same amount of European. However, Peninsulares were born in Spain, whereas the Creoles were born in the New World. But nothing else separated them. So when it does come time for independence, of course, the Creoles are none too happy that they are not given the same rights as the Peninsulares because of where their parents happen to have them. Right, that shouldn't matter, but it did. So that's why we see Creoles lead some of the revolution. But that's in Unit 5. Who's underneath the Creoles? Good. We have mestizos. Who are the mestizos? They're a combination of who, though? Good. So if we want to get specific, they're a combination of the Europeans and the indigenous. Underneath the mestizos, what mix do we see? Good. No, that's a hockey ice cleaning machine. The mulattoes are a combination of what two? Good, European and African. And then the Zambos. No, not Zimbabwe. The Zambos are a mixture of which two? Excellent. Yes. I did dot the I. It's just you can't see it. And then on the bottom we have indigenous Africans. So what seems to be the pattern here?
lighter the skin you are, the higher up the caste system you are.
Good. Unfortunately, it's organized by color. Where at the top of the pyramid we have the lighter Europeans. And on the bottom, we have darker. And that includes the mixed races also, which is why mestizos would be higher than mulattoes, which would be higher than zambos. Right? We can say it's not just Europeans versus non-Europeans, but there is very particularly an order here, and that order is based on color. And by the way, it's the same for the Indian caste system. Indians who are born in castes, because you're only supposed to marry within your caste, generally speaking, when the Aryans came down and set up the caste system in ancient India, they did the same thing. It was organized by color. Lighter-skinned Indians were offered and made part of higher castes. And because you only associate within your caste, it kind of propagates over time. So one of the things we see with both caste systems, the similarity between them, if you will, is the persistence of color, which is very unfortunate. Okay, so tell me about the kind of crops that we start to pop up in 1450 to 1750. Oh, it did change. All right, good. So one of the biggest things that we start seeing, not corn so much, although actually that reminds me, let's talk about the Columbian Exchange before we get too lost. Dan, ready?
Food of all sorts. Horses.
Okay, so if Europe and Africa are over there, they'd be a little higher up. What are some of the goods that originated in the Americas that made their way over to the New World? Good. Potatoes. What else?
Like corn?
Corn. Good. I mean, corn you can find everywhere, but that's mostly a Mesoamerican thing. What are some other goods that were in the New World and that got brought to the Old World that would not have existed in the Old World before the Columbian Exchange? Not sugar. Sugar is actually from Southeast Asia. It just happens to grow really well in the Caribbean, which is why they imported it there and it became so big. But we'll get to sugar in a moment. Beans. Good.
Squash,
Coffee.
chili, peppers, sunflower.
Citrus.
Beans, squash. What else? Coffee was an old world food, actually. But once again, it grew really well in the New World, so which is why they brought it. Avocado.
What's that animal?
And you're missing a big one that Italy couldn't live without, tomatoes. As far as animal species, turkeys.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Pretty much what they had to offer the world. No. Horses are very much an old world thing. Think about the Mongols. Right. Also, we can, just to bring it all the way back to Unit 1, we also see evidence of horse burials in ancient China, Shang China. So horses go back a really long history. But what about from Europe? What are some goods that only originated in Europe, Africa, or Asia, which made its way into the New World? Yeah, for the last time, horses. What are some other animals then?
Pig. Chicken.
Good. Pig, chicken, cow, sheep. And what's the most widely eaten animal in the world?
Pig? No. Lamb. No, not lamb. You said it.
I did say it. They like it a lot in the Caribbean and in Africa. Not ox. But they do like ox a lot.
Oh.
Nobody remember?
No, I don't know.
This is classic Jeopardy trivia you're missing out on.
Wait, what's the question?
Snake, dog.
Yes, snake is the most, tarantula is the most widely eaten. No, but you can eat tarantula. Apparently tarantula just tastes like shrimp, which makes me feel odd. It is goat, yes. Then you were correct. And then goat. What are some crops that only existed in Africa, Europe, or Asia? It's like a staple of Latin cuisine.
Oh, chocolate.
Rice.
No, chocolate's actually old world food.
Rice.
Rice, good.
Forever.
Rice is
What else?
Wheat.
Wheat, good. Barley, yeah, all the grains, all the cereal grains, barley. Rhubarb is very specific, and I don't know where. Very specific answer. I imagine that's probably Europe, Africa, but I'm not sure. It's called quinoa, and that's actually an old world food. Sorry, it's a new world food. Rice, wheat, barley, other really important ones, coffee, sugar, and citrus. All citrus fruits, including oranges, which are not native to Florida.
Bananas in the old.
Bananas. And different varieties of berries. So as you can see, the world changed significantly in terms of its diet after the Columbian Exchange. All of a sudden, populations in the New World have access to these foods, although many make the argument that it was detrimental to them because these foods grow really well in the New World. So on plantations, in this mercantile economy, they were brought there, and it made a lot of money for the rest of the world. But for the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia, they benefited tremendously from new varieties of foods, which increased population rates as there were more stable diets and people lived longer. And these cause, when we learn about Europe again, these cause all kinds of positive changes where they can focus on literacy because their health is improved and they're around longer, right? And things start to change for Europe also. And all of this was because of the Columbian Exchange. But then let's talk about some of the damaging effects of the Columbian Exchange. Not necessarily environmentally, but I want to talk about disease. And then I want to talk about like sugar plantations and how those popped up. So what's one major disease that makes its way over from Europe but wipes out a whole chunk of the population? Good. Smallpox. So smallpox is the human strain of cowpox. It started off as cowpox and kind of transitioned to smallpox over time. And essentially it would break out, remember the Black Death, you'd get a few buboes, and it'd be kind of gross. Smallpox manifests itself over like your entire body. You end up getting these small white pustules, Not like when you have a really bad zit, not like that. They're a little bit more clear because the pus is a little bit clear, not like solid white and opaque. So you have like these little pustules all over your body. You don't want to pop them because then you're more likely to spread the virus. Smallpox is a virus, right? Yes, it's horrible. And when the Europeans come into contact with the New World, why does it spread so efficiently?
Because their immune system kept it off.
Excellent. They didn't have immunity.
A single sneeze could end them all, and it did.
Kinda.
Almost.
They had no immunity to Afro-Eurasian diseases. Now, Black Death had kind of run its course already, so it's not like they're bringing over plague, right? However, we do see the spread of viruses, not bacteria, but viruses like smallpox, because they can carry on in a host for a long time. As I taught you, once you contract the virus, you have it forever, and that virus will always live inside your body. Usually it hides off in the recesses somewhere, and your body knows how to fight it off, so if it ever tries to make a resurgence, it'll kill it. But the virus doesn't go away. So when they are unknowingly bringing the smallpox virus to the New World, and the virus meets a population that it hasn't infected yet, it jumps, right? And it manages to kill off, modern estimates, anywhere from 50 to 80%. It's not like we can go back in time and count the bodies, right? So death estimates are always an estimate. Anywhere between 50 and 80% of the populations died from smallpox, which was pretty horrendous. But those that survived, what happened to them?
They became immune.
Stronger.
Right, but what are some of the... You are right. They do grow stronger. They become immune. But I want to talk about the survivors. Other than the fact that they have immunity, what's going to happen? I ruined everything. What's going to happen now with them?
There's not going to be so many people to work the land, so they're going to have like equal, not equal rights, but like a better wage, I guess.
Not yet.
A week.
The roots are taking over.
Soon, yes. But not yet. There are less indigenous peoples, but these lands have been colonized by the Spanish and Portuguese, right? So we don't have as many workers working on, let's say, sugar plantations all throughout Brazil. So where do the Portuguese and the Spanish start to turn? Good. And this is where we bring in African slaves. And this is the period of time where we see, and we call it the intensification of slave trade. Yes. The intensification of the slave trade out of Africa, primarily Central Africa with the Kingdom of the Congo, and then also West Africa. And we see the rise in the slave trade. And as sugar plantations become more and more profitable, we see more and more slaves being bought and brought over, and this is why we see the devastation of the Atlantic slave trade. So as we mentioned before, or as I just mentioned, a lot of them come from Western Africa, and then a lot of them also came from Southern Africa. Most slaves, I would argue about 50% of slaves were brought to South America, but particularly Brazil. I would argue another 40% of slaves were brought to the Caribbean, and only around 10% of slaves were brought to North America. Why is that? Why are more slaves being brought to Central America and South America than the United States?
Because they killed them off.
It's not that there's more farmable land, because there's farmable land in the United States, but what about the farmable land in the Caribbean and
Is
Brazil?
it more rich than?
It's not that it's more rich, the type of crop. Gordon.
Latin America were like killed and died because of the extreme conditions, and then the ones in America could live long enough to reproduce with each
But
other.
do you think
and have
Americans
children.
and
Yes, it does have to do with the type of slavery that we see. Now, in both cases, it's chattel slavery. But down in the South, and I'm talking like South America, not the U.S. South, in South America and the Caribbean, we see a lot of sugarcane plantations, which are notoriously difficult, as Gordon said, in terms of like working and living conditions. So a lot of them are dying off very quickly and need to be replaced with more purchases. Whereas in the North, it's primarily cotton. We do have some sugar plantations, but it's primarily things like cotton and tobacco. Cotton and tobacco in the North. And while those are also horrendous plantation agricultures, they're not as deadly as sugar plantations. Not to mention, it's not as hot and humid in the United States South as it. Now, it is real hot and humid down there. It's gross. But imagine that even more in the Caribbean and in Brazil, and you've just got a different situation. Also, and I don't really have this fleshed out yet, but perhaps it's also different between Spanish and Portuguese slavery versus British and American slavery. I'm not sure which class I talked about yesterday. It could have been you guys. But one of the things that we noticed with Central and South American colonies, no, I'm sorry, this is my honors class, with Central and South American colonies, their whole process of decolonization was completely different from that of Africa or Asia, and a lot of that had to do with the colonizing power. Spanish colonies transitioned to freedom in different ways because they encouraged intermarriage and intermingling, whereas with British and French colonies, they didn't. Right? That's one of the things we notice. That's why there's a large mestizo population that rules over Central and South America, but we don't see similar things happening in Africa and Asia to any large number. So this is the Atlantic slave trade. Slaves are going to the New World. What is leaving the New World and going back to Europe?
Sugar.
Well, how do we characterize those?
Good. Cash crops.
Well, not finished
I mean,
goods.
resources.
Raw materials or natural resources, you're right. Raw materials. And then what's leaving Africa and going back to America and also, sorry, what's leaving Europe and going back to America but also down to Africa? Good. Manufactured goods or finished goods. And sometimes this is called triangle trade, even though it's a weird wavy triangle. But we do see a general pattern of going around. But also keep in mind that a lot of these finished goods would go back to America. Mercantilism, right? They can only buy from their colonizing power. So it's almost a slap in the face that you would have manufacturers in, let's say, South Carolina producing tobacco. They sell the tobacco to the New World, and they don't make a lot of money, or sorry, to England, and don't make a lot of money off of it. And then England turns them into cigars and sells them back to South Carolinians. Seems a bit unnecessary. But then let's talk about what changes for Unit 5. So if we're in this colonial situation, right, how do things change for Latin America? Because this is the time of independence. This is when a lot of Latin American countries become independent. So how does that happen?
So Spain gets taken
Okay,
over.
by a French dude.
Napoleon.
Good. So Spain is conquered by Napoleon. What are some other things that cause independence? Who were they? What were they encouraged by?
But the Haitian
No, but what are some other revolutions that just happened? Let's say in the late 1700s.
Revolution.
Good. Haiti. What other revolutions happened? What encouraged the Haitian Revolution?
The American.
American and what else? And French. Good. So these are three different revolutions that were based off of what ideals?
Liberty.
Freedom, liberty, all that, which are all part of the Big E.
Enlightenment.
The Enlightenment. Good. The Enlightenment is really, really important. You need to remember this and how it impacts history. The Enlightenment, right? The idea that it stems from the scientific revolution. The idea that other than just questioning science and beliefs in physical nature, we should also question governments and society. If we're all born as Homo sapiens, to bring it back to Unit 1 for a second, if we're all born as Homo sapiens, then why aren't we all treated the same? Right? To the French, that also meant equality for color. It didn't mean that for anybody else. But the French also believed that, yeah, there's no difference between us. If you're a French citizen, you should be free. Which is why they set the Haitians free initially, before Napoleon took them over again. So the Enlightenment ideals encourage people like, yeah, why are we being colonized by a king thousands of miles away that doesn't know us or care about us? We should be free. But then there was another factor, especially in Spanish colonies, that encouraged independence. What other group wanted freedom for Latin America the most? Creoles. You would think that it would be the mestizos and the indigenous whose land was taken from them, but what we actually see are the Creoles encouraging rebellion. Why? What did they want? They wanted their own land. They wanted the power. So what we see, and we see the same thing in Africa with independence in the 1960s, is we see a transition of power away from European elites to Latin American elites. And all of a sudden it becomes the Creoles who are in power. And unfortunately, not much changes for daily life for mestizo populations and indigenous populations, or African populations that have made a home in the New World. All right, so nothing really changes there. Let's talk about Unit 6. So newly independent Latin American countries, now what? They're free. Everything awesome?
For someone.
No. For some people. But what patterns, what main two patterns did I hit you over the head with a lot that we see happening in modern-day Latin America?
Oh, they try to centralize and they fail, and they decentralize.
So how might we... Political instability, yes.
Oh, and economic dependency?
Excellent. So we have political instability and economic dependency. And we're going to see both of these things happen. I spelled that wrong. Economic dependency. And we see both of these things playing out in other regions as well, particularly Africa. So, political instability. What are the name of the group that they're kind of like the local leaders? They always want power. They're the strong men. Not the the Chaldeos. That's fine. Not the Cadillacs, not the quesadillas. Chaldeos. They kind of embody the idea of machismo, right? These big, strong men, but they're local leaders, and they're causing problems because how can you have a strong, centralized, liberal-based economy? Because Latin America wanted liberalism, much like how Western Europe had liberalism. How can you have a strong, centralized government with laws if you've got these local strongmen commanding all the power? Right? It's very much decentralized. So that was an issue also. But then if you go back to, remember Mexico? It's just a constant change in leaders. And in government structure. Remember, they were doing constitution after constitution. Mexico was an empire for like 3 minutes. Right? It's just this continual changeover of power, and all of that's going to lead to political instability. Another thing that we see, which you guys already said, is economic dependency. Who are they dependent on? Well, less Europe, actually. Yeah, I'm going to just characterize it as the West, but we actually see a lot of United States involvement, right? So one of them, Daniel just said, is the banana republics, which mostly took, not the store, which mostly took place in Central American countries like Guatemala, Honduras, and a little bit of Salvador. What was the point there?
So we support the, what do they call it?
Governments support us.
Don't we support dictators?
We do support dictators. Why?
But we were so scared.
Just so we can argue communists? Right, so we still have resources?
Good, that also. So we support dictators who oppose communism, but we also support dictators who support, what you guys said, who support us. And they support American economic interests, like the banana. I know it seems kind of silly, but bananas were like super fancy back in the day. It was hard to get your hands on bananas. This is before refrigeration became that great, so we had to find a way of getting bananas from Central America to the United States. And once we could do that, people were like, this is a magical fruit. Like, they'd never encountered bananas before and had it. And it became, and I think it still is, the most popular fruit in the United States. I believe so. Bananas were huge. It was like this huge thing. So it kind of reminds me of the mercantile period where all of a sudden we have sugar and everybody's like, oh, I love sugar now. I'm addicted to sugar. There was like this, it sounds really weird, but there was like a banana boom in the 50s. And everybody was obsessed with bananas in the United States. Obsessed. This is where the Chiquita banana lady comes in. Like with the fruit hat, and she's like, you know, she's all excited. And like this is, so we became obsessed with bananas. And so the United States is like, oh, opportunity to make money, excellent. And so we started to build these banana companies in Central America because the dictators allowed us to do so. And who's doing the labor? Latin Americans, and not slaves. Yeah, we're in the 1900s, we're not slaves anymore. But who's doing a lot of the labor on these lands? Who might we expect in a casta system would be doing a lot of the labor? The indigenous people, the bottom of the caste system. And unfortunately, this is what leads to some problems. It was their land to begin with. It was taken from them. And now they have to work the land and they make very little money. And some of them organized, and some of them did become communist. And so these dictators would use that as an excuse to go in and reclaim the lands to try to stop communism. Gordon.
Bananas are now third place.
Behind who?
Behind apples and then berries on top.
Berries? Like which berry? Just collective berries?
Just berries.
That's weird. That is very vague. Because there are some berries that are better than other berries. Yes.
What if there was an indigenous person on the caste system who was born really, really white? Do they classify them as higher up, or is it just
So when we went over the caste system, there was like a whole designation for the amount of European blood in you. So yeah, it depends on your lineage, more so than just the color of your skin.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a really good question. The question was, if you couldn't hear, what happens if you were indigenous but you were born really light-skinned? There would still be parental, lineage, and they would look at it that way. All right, so that's what's going on in Latin America today. What are some other examples of American intervention that we see in Latin America? Cuba. Let's talk about Cuba. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about with Cuba. Who are some of the main players in the Cuban Revolution? Good. I heard the other one first. So Fidel Castro and Che Guevara.
That one.
No,
Oh, okay.
are you good?
Ernesto Che Guevara.
That was my friend's name.
I'm glad that you had a friend named Ernesto. So what did these guys want for Cuba?
I remember.
What did these guys want for Cuba? Well, freedom is vague. More rights for who?
They didn't
More rights for everyone. They didn't agree with the ruler. What government system did they want? Good. They wanted communism. Now, what's the historical context behind this? Why communism? Why the 1950s? Why Cuba? Like, where do they get these ideas from? Part of it comes from the Soviet Union, which in 1917 saw like the rise of a communist rebellion. It pulls them out of World War I. They got to deal with it, right? What other countries had turned communist by like 1953? China, right? In 1949, China becomes communist, also at the end of the Chinese Civil War. It had also spread to Korea by that point. We fight the Korean War in 1950 to 1953. So we're already heavily engaged with communism at this point. Why do you suppose they wanted communism? What did it offer? What did they think that communism would offer Cuba? I guess more equality for the people.
Some countries they just didn't want to follow that kind of westernization.
Yeah, that's particularly with Iran. We'll look at that when we talk about Iran again. But generally, they wanted equality for the people, and they thought the best way to do that was to have communism. But I have to be specific. They're not talking Marxism, like where there's like this worker revolution against the bourgeois, right? We don't see that in Cuba. What they wanted was more like Leninism, where a handful of people in a political party will fight for your freedom, and then they will make sure that you are free afterwards. It's how, right, that doesn't really work. That's how we have communism today. We don't have the kind of society where there's no government, no social classes, everybody's equal, it's utopia. The communist revolutions that we've seen since Russia have been Russian-based, meaning they're Leninist, meaning a handful of guys who run the Communist Party will take over and will govern in your best interests. Sounds a bit more like socialism, right? But that's their style of communism. So the Castro brothers took over Cuba. Che Guevara continued to go on and campaign in other places. He went to the Democratic Republic of Congo and fought for communism there. He fought for communism in Mexico for a little while. That's actually where he met the Castro brothers. And then he fought for communism in Bolivia, where he was found and executed by the CIA. The Bolivians, by the way, are socialists today. Bolivia is the other socialist country in Latin America. So that was the idea behind Cuban communism. And how did the United States react to this?
Well,
Freaking out.
Yeah, we were freaking out.
Way too
get
close
it
to
there.
Florida.
And then they
We're a
have
certain
like,
kind of life.
All right, and we're back on. So here's why Cuba matters so much. So I'm going to, in red for communism. Communism starts here in Russia. It spreads to Eastern Europe. You see that iron curtain descending across Europe, right? And then it spreads down into China by 1949. 1950, it's spreading to Korea. Then it starts to break out in Cuba. And it wasn't in Vietnam yet. And the United States is sitting there like, what is happening to the right? They're terrified. They're concerned about what they call the domino effect, that one country after another are going to fall to communism, and at the end of the domino chain is the United States. And what if communism were to spread to the United States? We'd lose everything our Constitution is built on. We'd lose our capitalist system, and life as we know it would completely change. And so we were so terrified of it, we engaged in a policy we call containment, where we wanted to contain communism wherever it spread. It's what led us to Korea, it's what led us to Vietnam. But with Cuba, which is what I want to focus on, we did what?
We tried to invade. It didn't work.
We tried to invade Cuba. The first was something called the Bay of Pigs invasion. What was that?
There we go. They failed.
Failed CIA invasion with rebels to like overthrow the government.
This is my bad pig.
1 point.
I completely messed it up. What was wrong with the Bay of Pigs invasion? What did we try to do?
We used Russia.
What did we try to do? What was the end goal?
Assassinate.
Yeah.
Fidel.
Yeah, we tried to assassinate Fidel Castro.
Oh dang, that's how you.
Right off the bat, dang.
But like egg on the face, they called us out, and it was really embarrassing. It's like, oh, like, no, right? Relationships soured very badly after that. And shortly after that, Cuba starts to ask for more help from the Soviet Union, and that's how we get nukes. in Cuba pointed at the United States, which brings us to the closest we've ever come to nuclear war. All right. Luckily, we managed to resolve the situation with Russia, actually. Russia told Cuba to put its nukes away. It was removed. The threat had ended. But it was really tense relationship between the two, and it's remained tense ever since. The United States has put embargoes on Cuba. Cuba's responded, you guys mentioned it before during the break, by sending a flotilla, right, the flotilla of criminals, just emptying the Cuban prison system and sending all of them to Florida, right? And ever since, there's just been really uncomfortable relationships between the two. So when we look at modern-day Latin America, we still see a lot of economic dependency on other places of the world, but in other areas as well, like in Panama, they seem to be doing pretty well because they now have control over their own canal, right? And they're making a lot of money off of that. They can make several $100,000 in tax off one ship. Dozens of ships go through a day. So they're making a lot of money in taxes. So while some Latin American countries are doing okay, others are still suffering from political instability, from violence, and from economic dependency. And the best example for that, of course, is Venezuela. All right, so it's a long history. It started off as really strong, powerful, centralized militaristic kingdoms like the Aztec and the Inca. The relationship completely changed when Europeans arrived in the New World, to the benefit of Europeans, to the detriment, for the most part, of Latin Americans. And then after that, we've seen economic dependency and instability ever since in Latin America. Tomorrow, sorry I took up the entire period with Latin America. Tomorrow we're going to take a look at Africa, right, instead of Europe. So tomorrow we're going to try to knock out all of Africa, Units 1 to Unit 6.